I couldn't believe it was our 10th anniversary. I had spent the entire morning meticulously preparing, choosing a deep red dress that hugged my curves just enough, doing my hair in soft waves, and carefully applying makeup so that Ethan would notice the effort I had put in. I had been excited all week, imagining a quiet romantic dinner at the city's finest restaurant, one that he had insisted he had made reservations at months in advance. But as soon as we stepped through the restaurant doors, I felt that familiar twist of unease in my stomach. Ethan's eyes, instead of meeting mine with the warmth I had hoped for, immediately found Sophie, one of the young waitresses who was balancing a tray of wine glasses with effortless grace. His gaze lingered far too long, and he smirked, leaning slightly as if to get a better look. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping I was imagining things. But the subtle tilt of his head, the way he smiled as though she were the only woman in the room, made my chest tighten. I leaned slightly toward him, lowering my voice, and whispered, "Please stop staring. People notice." My words were quiet, more a plea than a confrontation. For a moment, I thought he would just glance away, but instead, his eyes flashed with a dangerous mix of anger and humiliation. The world seemed to slow down. Before I could even process what was happening, Ethan's hand shot across the table, connecting with my face with a sharp, explosive force. The room went silent. My lips split immediately, a warm, metallic taste flooding my mouth as blood trickled down my chin. Gasps erupted around us, the delicate clink of wine glasses punctuating the shock. The waiter froze mid-step, Sophie's tray trembling in her hands. I instinctively put my hand to my face, my fingers slick with blood, my mind struggling to catch up with the reality Ethan had just hit me in front of his family, in front of dozens of strangers over a glance at another woman. I felt the burn of humiliation sear through me faster than the sting on my cheek. Margaret, his mother sitting prim and poised at the next table, did not rise or intervene. She only leaned slightly toward Vanessa, whispering something with a thin smile that twisted my stomach. Richard, his father, avoided eye contact entirely, his gaze fixed firmly on the table as though the event hadn't happened. Mark, Ethan's brother, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, offering no protection, no comfort. Vanessa, his sister-in-law, smirked openly, a cruel, gleeful expression that seemed to mock my shock and pain. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Meanwhile, a few guests discreetly pulled out their phones, the glow of screens capturing the instant my world fractured. I heard snippets of murmured conversations. "Did you see that? Oh my God, is that really happening?" My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The room felt simultaneously enormous and suffocating. I wanted to shrink to disappear, but at the same time, I wanted to scream to make everyone see what he had done, to make them understand that this wasn't just a moment of anger. It was the culmination of years of subtle control threats and physical intimidation that no one had ever acknowledged publicly. Sophie. The waitress looked horrified, frozen halfway between the kitchen and our table. Her eyes darted nervously to Ethan, then back to me as if seeking permission to intervene. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, the mixture of fear, shame, and shock. The metallic taste of blood in my mouth made it impossible to swallow my panic quietly. Ethan leaned back, the image of composed arrogance, his hand slowly retreating as though nothing had occurred, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I wanted to melt into the floor, to vanish, but I also wanted him to see that I would not vanish quietly this time. My mind raced, replaying every humiliating moment we had endured in private. The shoved doors, the harsh words, the subtle intimidation, the silent, deadly control he had exercised over my life. And now, in a room full of witnesses, he had crossed a line that no one could ignore. The camera phones capturing the event would become my silent allies, my proof, my witnesses when no one in his family ever had been. The stares of strangers pressed on me, some horrified, some curious, all aware of the betrayal unfolding at the table. I felt a mixture of rage and disbelief, a raw, primal understanding that nothing could ever erase this moment. But maybe, just maybe, it could be the spark that finally ended years of invisible oppression. My chest heaved, my lips trembling, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something unfamiliar, the stirrings of defiance. I had always longed for a family, My mother had passed away when I was barely 17, leaving me with a hollow sense of longing and the fragile hope that one day I would find a home where I belonged. When I met Ethan, I believed I had found that family, that stability, that sense of security I had craved for so long. On the surface, he was everything a woman might envy: tall, confident, successful, polished in every way. But beneath the facade of charm and sophistication, there was a cold, calculating streak, one that I wouldn't fully recognize until it had already ensnared me. His family was just as formidable in their own ways. Margaret, his mother, was a woman of sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, a matriarch who demanded obedience and often disguised cruelty under the guise of etiquette. She prided herself on appearances, and any hint of conflict had to be smoothed over quickly, preferably by someone else's humiliation. Vanessa, his sister-in-law, was a subtle predator, always ready to laugh at my missteps, always ready to whisper cutting remarks that made me doubt myself. Richard, his father, was quiet, a passive man whose silence often spoke louder than words. Mark, his brother, was complicit in small ways, a nod here, a smirk there, always on Ethan's side, never mine. I had married into this world, not fully realizing that the family I longed for would often treat me as an outsider. Every mistake, every moment of discomfort was a reflection of my inadequacy in their eyes. And Ethan, my husband, made sure I never forgot my place. He controlled our finances, limiting my access to our accounts, questioning every expenditure I dared make. He insisted that every decision, no matter how small, went through him first, as though my judgment alone was unworthy of consideration. I had tried in the early months of our marriage to voice my discomfort, to assert myself, but his charm would melt my protests, and his controlling tendencies would reassert themselves cloaked in love or concern. Over time, subtle manipulations turned into harsher realities. Doors were slammed, arguments ended with me locked out of rooms, my phone confiscated, my movements monitored. I had photographs tucked into my phone, a visual diary of bruises on my arms, dark marks fading into my skin, small but undeniable evidence of repeated physical intimidation. The first time I had visited a doctor with these bruises, she had looked at me carefully and asked, "Did someone hurt you?" I had shaken my head, too scared, too ashamed to speak. The world outside Ethan's gaze had never noticed or had chosen to look away, leaving me to internalize a creeping sense of worthlessness. Gaslighting became a constant companion in our marriage. "You're too sensitive," he would say after every push, every shove, every word that made my heart race with fear. "You bruise too easily." And always the family would echo his subtle justifications. "He's a hot-tempered man, you just need to be patient." Margaret would say, her voice smooth but unyielding. I became trapped in a network of silent complicity, a web where the blame always landed on me and the enablers cloaked in civility continued their quiet oppression. This background, this endless cycle of control, belittlement, and intimidation was the invisible thread that had led to the moment in the restaurant. The guests around me saw the dramatic result, the blood, the shock, but they didn't know the full story, the years of small and large humiliations that had led to this public spectacle. And even now, with the sting on my cheek and the metallic taste of blood, I felt that familiar mix of fear and recognition. Fear that this pattern could continue indefinitely. Recognition that finally, in front of strangers, in front of witnesses, I might have a chance to expose it. I had spent years trying to appease Ethan, trying to fit into a family that never truly wanted me, trying to survive the slow erosion of my self-worth. Each dinner party, each holiday gathering, each casual visit had been a test of endurance, of staying polite while being ridiculed, of smiling while being demeaned, of nodding while being controlled. And tonight at our anniversary dinner, the culmination of those years of tension erupted in the most undeniable way possible, a slap that left blood on my lips and fury boiling in my chest. The restaurant, so opulent and grand, felt suddenly like a cage, a theater where my life had been on display long before I realized it. The guests, the chandeliers, the wait staff, all silent witnesses, were now part of a drama I had not consented to, but one that might finally shine light on the shadows I had been forced to live in. I could feel the weight of the family's eyes. Margaret's cold appraisal, Vanessa's cruel amusement, Richard's avoidance, Mark's complicity. And I understood in that instant that the isolation I had endured was both my torment and my secret weapon. Every insult, every ignored plea, every manipulated emotion had prepared me for this moment, the awareness that I had suffered for years in silence. But now, silence was no longer an option. I could not undo the past, could not erase the sting of the slap or the sight of Ethan's smug indifference. But I could prepare myself for the confrontation ahead. And in that realization, the first spark of defiance flickered a small but potent ember against the long, cold history of oppression that had defined my marriage. The past was a series of shadows that I had tried so desperately to forget, yet each memory clung to me vivid and unrelenting. Ethan's control began subtly, almost imperceptibly in the early months of our marriage. A hand placed a little too firmly on my wrist, a shove that I excused as clumsiness, doors slammed not at objects but to remind me of my place. Over time, these small gestures became larger, more deliberate, and terrifyingly consistent. There were nights when arguments escalated quickly. A disagreement over dinner plans would end with him gripping my arms until I flinched, pushing me against walls, leaving faint but unmistakable bruises that I would try to hide under long sleeves. Once, in a heated confrontation about a missed bill, he slammed the front door so hard I was trapped inside the lock, clicking behind me. I had no way out for what felt like hours, the tension coiling in my chest like a living thing, and I realized that my sanctuary, my home, had become a prison. I began documenting the evidence in secret, capturing the silent proof of my suffering. A photograph of a purple bruise on my forearm after he had yanked me roughly. Another of my shoulder red and swollen from a shove that sent me sprawling across the kitchen floor. My phone became a repository of fear and truth. I had never shown anyone, not a friend, not a family member, not even a colleague. The shame and disbelief I anticipated from outsiders kept me silent. Yet, even when confronted by medical professionals, the instinctive fear of Ethan's wrath outweighed the need for disclosure. I remember a doctor peering at my arm, tilting her head and asking in a soft voice, "Did someone hurt you?" My throat had tightened. I nodded almost imperceptibly but said nothing. That silence became habitual, a survival mechanism honed over years. Each injury he inflicted was accompanied by words designed to destabilize me emotionally. "You're too sensitive," he would sneer after each shove or push. "You overreact. You make mountains out of molehills." He normalized the violence, reframing it as my fault, as proof that I needed his guidance, his control. And always the family looked the other way. Margaret's advice was chillingly simple. "He has a temper. Just bear with it. Keep the peace." Vanessa would chuckle under her breath during gatherings, a quiet reminder that the world around me endorsed my humiliation. Richard avoided eye contact as though his silence could erase the wrongs being committed. Mark nodded in agreement with Ethan, a silent accomplice, reinforcing my isolation. Over time, I learned to anticipate the violence, to measure my words, to calculate every action that might provoke a reaction. But no amount of caution could fully shield me. I was trapped in a pattern, one that left emotional scars just as deep as the physical ones. Gaslighting was constant. After each incident, Ethan would recast events as misunderstandings, make me question my own memories, doubt the severity of my injuries. "It wasn't that bad," he would say, his voice calm, unnervingly soothing. "You always think the worst." I began doubting myself, the line between fear and guilt blurring until it was nearly invisible. The culmination of this abuse was a history, a record, a narrative I had painstakingly preserved on my phone. Timestamps, photographs, even notes about what was said, who was present, and how I felt afterward. It was quiet, private, but undeniable. A body of evidence that chronicled years of coercion, intimidation, and assault. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when I wondered if anyone would believe me, if the world would care. But the truth of my lived experience was undeniable. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate pattern, one that had escalated in severity and frequency, and one that could not be dismissed as a single lapse in judgment. This past was heavy a weight pressing against my chest every time I thought about the evening ahead, and yet it had prepared me in ways I had not realized. The years of careful documentation of silent observation of internalized fear now offered me a lifeline. I had proof. I had photographs, records, and a detailed account of repeated abuse. And when the slap came in the restaurant, the blood on my lip was not an isolated event. It was the final visible expression of a long history. For the first time in years, I realized that my preparation, my quiet endurance could empower me. The world outside that restaurant, the witnesses, the cameras, and even the waitstaff could now see not just a single act of violence, but the entire continuum of control and abuse that had defined my marriage. And in that recognition, a flicker of hope sparked within me. A hope that the truth, undeniable and irrefutable, could finally bring justice. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional laughter of diners, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Laura stood by the table, her heart racing, the excitement of their anniversary mingling uneasily with the familiar tension that had always followed Ethan's gaze. She had chosen her red dress carefully elegant but subtle, hoping to celebrate the evening with grace. Ethan complimented her as she approached his words, honeyed his smile charming, yet Laura couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered not on her but on Sophie, the young waitress delivering their wine. A flash of discomfort surged through Laura. "Please," she murmured under her breath, leaning close, "stop, staring. People notice." The words were barely audible, a gentle plea. But the moment they left her lips, the air seemed to still, as if the world had been holding its breath. Ethan's expression darkened, and in a movement too swift to react to his hand, struck her face with force. The sharp crack of impact seemed to echo through the elegant room. Laura staggered slightly, tasting blood as it spilled onto her lip, a red reminder of years of suppressed fear and humiliation. Conversation faltered at nearby tables. Glasses were left mid-lift, forks paused in mid-air. Gasps rippled outward from the diners closest to them. Her dress now marred with the glint of blood, Laura felt the familiar swell of shock and disbelief that had always accompanied his violence. Ethan's hand dropped casually to his side as if nothing had happened, his composure unshaken. Margaret, seated to the right, leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, lips whispering with icy calm, "Laura, don't make a scene." Vanessa, smirking across the table, added with a cruel lilt, "That's what you get for nagging." Richard averted his gaze entirely, bowing his head, the silence from him an enabler's shield. Mark, seated quietly, seemed almost invisible, yet his presence was a tacit confirmation of complicity. The waitstaff, including Sophie, froze, mid-motion, eyes wide, unsure whether to intervene. Sophie's fingers hovered over the edge of a tray, the decision to act weighed down by Margaret's warning glance. Phones began to emerge from the pockets of curious diners. Some started recording the red glow of screens illuminating their shocked faces. Laura's vision blurred, part from the pain, part from the swirl of humiliation. She felt the weight of every eye on her, every judgment, unspoken, yet palpable. The world she had known, the safe celebratory evening she had imagined, had dissolved into an arena of public shame. Yet amid the fear, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years flickered clarity. This wasn't just a slap, it was the culmination of years of control, manipulation, and secrecy. And now, all of it was laid bare, unavoidable, undeniable. The contrast between Ethan's calm and the vivid redness on her lip created a tableau of power and vulnerability that drew both sympathy and outrage from those watching. Some diners shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other, a wave of collective disapproval beginning to form. For the first time, Laura realized that she was not entirely alone. Strangers, people who had no stake in her life, were witnessing the injustice. Each pair of eyes that met hers without judgment felt like a lifeline, a subtle validation that what she had endured was real, that she had been wronged. Ethan, sensing the attention, leaned back slightly, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative with charm and excuses that went unspoken yet palpable in the air. He whispered something to Margaret, and her response was a dismissive nod, reinforcing the notion that this was merely a private matter, an assertion that the world was starting to reject even as whispers swirled around the room. The humiliation was complete, public, and all-consuming. Laura could feel the familiar tightening in her chest, the old fear she had carried for years, yet mingled with it was a new sensation, an awakening of defiance. This single act of violence performed in front of witnesses had inadvertently empowered her. The eyes of strangers, the hum of quiet indignation, the subtle shaking of hands holding phones ready to capture the truth. It all combined into a potent reminder she no longer had to endure this silently. The evening meant to celebrate love and commitment had instead become a stage for exposure. And within that exposure lay the first threads of her liberation. The blood on her lip, the shocked stares, the tension that crackled through the room. They were not just symbols of shame, but of undeniable proof. And proof was the beginning of power. Laura's pulse raced, the pain on her face blending with an adrenaline-fueled clarity. This night, which began with expectation, had transformed into a crucible. Her mind began cataloging potential responses, small acts of resistance, ways to reclaim dignity amid the chaos. For the first time, she realized that her story, her suffering, was visible, and that visibility could no longer be ignored. The stage was set, the witnesses present, and the choice was hers: continue to suffer in silence, or begin the long, deliberate act of reclaiming her life. And as she steadied herself, wiping the blood with the back of her hand, a quiet but determined thought settled into her mind. No more hiding, no more excuses. Tonight was the beginning of confrontation, of exposure, and of justice, public, undeniable, and unavoidable. Laura's hand trembled slightly as she touched her swollen lip, blood still glinting under the soft chandelier light. The shock was still raw, the humiliation heavy on her shoulders, but beneath the quiver a flicker of defiance sparked. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her, every whisper of gossip amplifying the weight of the moment. Ethan's smirk, intended to intimidate, now seemed almost desperate. His composure, so carefully cultivated, cracked ever so slightly under the scrutiny of strangers. Laura took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the pain anchor her, but not control her. Then she spoke. Her voice, though tinged with fear, rang clear across the table. Enough. Heads turned. Forks paused mid-air, the hum of the restaurant dipping into a tense silence. Enough, she repeated louder this time, her words cutting through the murmurs. You embarrassed yourself, not me. The words hung in the air, shaking the invisible chains that had bound her for years. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, a flicker of anger crossing his features. Sit down before you regret it, he said, attempting to regain control, his tone low but threatening. Laura's heart pounded, a cocktail of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. But this time she refused to cower. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met his gaze directly. I already regret marrying a man who thinks hitting his wife is normal, she declared, her voice trembling slightly but strong enough to cut through the tense atmosphere. A ripple of surprise ran across the restaurant. Some diners leaned forward, their eyes widening, phones discreetly recording. The sound of whispers grew louder, a collective murmur that marked the shift from private violence to public exposure. Ethan's face reddened, not from exertion, but from the embarrassment of being watched, judged, and recorded. His carefully maintained image as a successful, composed man was cracking in front of dozens of strangers. Laura felt a rush of something she hadn't felt in years, control over her own narrative. She continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Do you think this is love? Do you think this is how a husband treats his wife? Her questions hung in the air, rhetorical but piercing, forcing the room to feel the injustice they had witnessed. Some diners shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mixture of shock, sympathy, and indignation. Sophie, the waitress who had inadvertently been the object of Ethan's wandering eyes, straightened, emboldened by Laura's courage. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the tray she had been holding, and though Margaret's sharp glance threatened silence, Sophie's eyes betrayed a spark of defiance. Laura noticed and felt a small surge of solidarity. She was no longer entirely alone. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, the carefully controlled rage of a man used to obedience, now flaring in a room full of witnesses. He opened his mouth, probably to bark more threats, but the reality of being exposed, of being caught red-handed, froze him. Laura seized the moment. You are not untouchable, she said, her voice now firm and unwavering. "You are not above the law and you are not above scrutiny. This ends tonight." The words acted like a magnet for the restaurant's attention. People shifted in their seats, some nodding slightly, others discreetly filming the scene, their curiosity and horror mingling. Ethan's mother, Margaret, leaned forward, her voice sharp and controlling. "Laura, sit down. This is private." But Laura shook her head. "No, this is not private anymore," she said firmly. "You think this is just between us, but everyone saw, everyone heard. You are not allowed to do this, and I will not stay silent." Vanessa across the table let out a derisive laugh. "Oh, really? You think standing up changes anything?" she sneered. Laura ignored the jibe, letting the disdain roll off her like water. Richard, as usual, avoided eye contact, silent in his complicity, and Mark shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the dynamics of power he had once taken for granted were beginning to crumble. Laura's pulse raced, the sting of the slap still sharp on her face, but now it was joined by a potent mixture of liberation and righteous anger. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into determination. The restaurant, once a place of celebration, had become a stage where truth and courage could no longer be ignored. Laura's gaze swept across the faces of strangers, noting the subtle shifts, the diners who looked sympathetic, the couple murmuring encouragement, the young man raising his phone to record evidence. Each small acknowledgement bolstered her courage, feeding a growing sense that she was no longer powerless. Ethan tried again, his voice raising a bark of authority intended to reassert dominance. "Laura, you are making a fool of yourself." But she met his glare unwavering. "I am making sure the world knows who you really are." She shot back the sting of pain, mixing with the fire of defiance. The hush that followed was almost tangible, a room holding its collective breath as the confrontation played out in real time. Laura's eyes welled with tears, not of fear this time, but of a release long denied. She had spoken, she had resisted, and she had made the first public stand against years of secrecy and abuse. The moment was electric, charged with tension and the undeniable thrill of taking a stand. And as Ethan's jaw tightened, the room still buzzing with whispers and the quiet hum of recording devices, Laura knew this was only the beginning. Her rebellion had begun small but undeniable, and the path to reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her freedom had finally opened. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope tinged with righteous fury, a perfect storm of emotional undulation that promised a reckoning yet to come. The tension in the restaurant thickened like a storm cloud about to burst. Laura's defiance hung in the air, impossible to ignore, and yet the people closest to her, her supposed family, chose silence, complicity, and cold judgment instead of support. Margaret, her mother-in-law, leaned forward, her eyes sharp with irritation, the fine lines of her face tightening. "Laura, this is private," she hissed the words, slicing through the room as if her authority could undo the spectacle unfolding in front of everyone. "Sit down before you make things worse." But Laura shook her head slowly, deliberately. She had already made a choice. This was no longer about keeping peace. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Private Laura's voice trembled with disbelief, anger surging through her veins. "Private. You call being hit, humiliated, and silenced private." Her words echoed against the marble floors, reverberating across the room, and for the first time, some of the diners shifted uncomfortably, realizing the hypocrisy of appearances. Vanessa, Ethan's younger sister, couldn't resist her cruelty. She smirked, tilting her head as though Laura's courage was laughable. "If you can't handle a little slap, maybe you don't belong in this family," Vanessa said, her tone dripping with condescension. Laughter, soft and cruel, trickled from her lips, meant to wound, meant to intimidate. Laura felt her stomach churn with revulsion, the betrayal cutting deeper than the slap ever could. She had already been abandoned emotionally, but to hear it declared aloud in front of strangers made the pain almost unbearable. Richard, her father-in-law, a man who had always chosen avoidance over action, sat stiffly, eyes cast down, fingers drumming against the table. He made no move to intervene, no word of protest. Mark Ethan's brother shifted uneasily in his chair, sensing the growing hostility in the room, but unwilling to step into the storm. Laura's chest tightened, the crushing weight of isolation pressing down, yet underneath the despair, a flame of determination burned brighter. She took a deep, shuddering breath, letting the anger fuel her voice, letting the humiliation sharpen her words. A little slap, she repeated, disbelief lacing every syllable. "Do you call this love? Do you call this marriage?" Some heads in the restaurant began to nod subtly, a few diners exchanging glances, realizing the cruelty they were witnessing, the injustice being normalized. Laura felt a surge of courage. She wasn't alone anymore. The world was watching, and in that scrutiny lay her strength. She could see the discomfort in Margaret's eyes, the sharp intake of breath from Vanessa, the hesitation in Mark's movements. For the first time, the facade of family unity, the protective shell that had shielded Ethan for years, began to crack. "You think this is acceptable?" Laura continued, her voice rising with every word. "You sit there watching me bleed, and you tell me to sit down, that my suffering is just a private matter." Her words hit like thunder, reverberating across the room, leaving a silence so heavy that it pressed against everyone's ears. A waitress in the corner shifted her eyes wide with shock, unsure how to intervene, but clearly moved by the audacity of Laura's stand. Even a few diners previously immersed in their meals lowered forks, phones forgotten on the tables, drawn into the gravity of the confrontation. Ethan's face flushed, the anger in his eyes barely contained. "Laura, enough," he snapped, but his voice lacked the absolute authority it once commanded. The crowd's gaze was heavy, a collective judgment that chipped away at his dominance. Margaret's composure wavered. She leaned back slightly, her hand clenching at her side, realizing that her own power over Laura's image of fear was slipping. Vanessa's laughter died on her lips as she caught the shifting energy in the room. Even Richard, who had remained a silent witness for years, now seemed unsettled, aware that this moment was breaking the code of silent complicity. Laura's hands were shaking, but her resolve was solidifying. Years of enduring, of hiding, of fearing were now channeled into this single, unrelenting stand. She locked eyes with Margaret. "You condone this behavior. You protect him. But no more." She set her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I am done being your victim, and everyone here will know the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath. Some diners whispered encouragement to her, others raised phones ready to capture evidence that could finally hold Ethan accountable. Laura's gaze swept the table, catching each family member's reaction. Shock, denial, discomfort, guilt, and for the first time she felt the power of exposure. The protective shield that had allowed years of abuse to continue unchallenged was crumbling. She could feel the momentum shift, the invisible scales of justice beginning to tilt. Ethan's hand moved as if to strike again, but hesitation crossed his face. He was aware now that the world was watching, that witnesses and cameras could turn a private act into public accountability. Laura, sensing the opening, pressed forward. "I will not stay silent anymore. Your family, your rules, your threats, they don't control me. Not today, not ever." A ripple of murmurs passed through the restaurant. The silence of complicity was breaking. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but the authority she once wielded over Laura's compliance was slipping. Vanessa's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. Richard shifted, uncomfortably silent, but aware that something had changed. Even Mark's posture became defensive, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Laura felt her pulse surge with adrenaline, fear now intertwined with triumph. She had faced the scorn of her in-laws, the humiliation in front of strangers, and yet stood tall. The first wave of defiance had ignited a spark that would grow into an uncontainable fire. And in that charged silence, Laura realized the family she had married into had turned their backs, but that very betrayal had given her the ultimate weapon: truth, amplified by exposure, courage, fueled by outrage, and the unstoppable momentum of public scrutiny. Tonight, nothing would be the same. The room was suspended in a tense silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every heartbeat deafening. Laura's defiance hung like a banner in the air, her eyes blazing as she stared down the family who had abandoned her. But just as the tension reached its peak, a familiar voice cut through the stillness with authority and conviction. Domestic violence is not a family matter. It's a crime, Mr. Carter, a sharply dressed man in his 40s, stood from a nearby table, his voice calm but resonant, commanding attention. He had been dining quietly, a friend of Ethan's from law school, yet his presence now carried weight beyond polite recognition. The words reverberated across the room, piercing through the fear, the shame, and the attempts at denial. For a moment, the restaurant itself seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's face tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing her features, but Mr. Carter's gaze was unwavering, steady, and deliberate. Laura's heart leapt at the unexpected support, the appearance of an ally at the precise moment when her courage could have faltered. Sophie, the young waitress whose name had been caught in the heated gaze of Ethan earlier, took a hesitant step forward. Her voice, barely above a whisper, at first grew stronger as she continued. "He's been harassing me too, all night." The room stiffened, the revelation snapping the invisible cord of denial that had held the family together. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the diners, phones tilted subtly, people starting to record the unfolding truth. The weight of public scrutiny began to settle onto Ethan's shoulders. No longer was this just a private act of aggression. It was an accumulation of misconduct, harassment, and long-standing abuse now exposed in plain sight. Ethan's face went pale, lips parting in disbelief. His authoritative mask cracked as he realized that witnesses and the casual presence of law enforcement-minded citizens could turn this night into a legal trap. Mr. Carter approached slowly, his movements measured but unyielding. "Laura," he said, turning his professional attention toward her, "I've known Ethan for years and I've never condoned violence. But seeing this now, it's clear that action must be taken. You have every right to protect yourself, and the law is on your side." Laura's pulse raced, relief mingling with residual fear. She felt the years of silence, of hidden bruises and unanswered cries crystallize into a sudden, tangible validation. The power of truth had found its moment. She raised her phone, opening the folder of photographs she had taken over the years, images of bruised arms, hands, and wrists. The hidden pain Ethan had inflicted repeatedly, often dismissed by his family as temper or accident. The photos glowed on the screen in sharp relief under the restaurant lights. "This," Laura said, her voice shaking, but firm, "is not a single moment of anger. This is years of abuse, and it ends tonight." Gasps filled the air. Some diners whispered encouragement, others edged closer, pointing cameras discreetly. Sophie's own face reflected a mix of fear and admiration. She had been silenced by her youth, by fear of retaliation, but the courage Laura exhibited gave her a spark. "I've seen it too," Sophie added, her voice firmer now. "He's done this to other women, subtle threatening, making them afraid to speak up. Tonight is the first time I can say anything." The room grew electric, the tension snapping and rewiring itself into a collective moral judgment. Margaret's composure faltered. She leaned on the edge of the table, eyes darting between Laura, Mr. Carter, and the diners. Vanessa's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by the faint tremor of uncertainty. Even Richard shifted in his seat, a man who had preferred silence over justice, now faced with the undeniable exposure of his son's repeated cruelty. Ethan, realizing that private intimidation had failed, attempted to reach for Laura's phone. But a few diners stepped forward, quietly but firmly, creating a buffer between him and the evidence of his wrongdoing. "Stop," Mr. Carter said calmly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Any attempt to interfere with evidence is obstruction. You will face the consequences of your actions." Ethan froze. The mask of arrogance shattered, replaced by a flicker of fear he hadn't felt in years. The murmurs and whispers transformed into audible acknowledgement, diners nodding, capturing the proof, subtly aligning themselves with Laura's courage. In that moment, the trajectory of the evening shifted. What began as a public humiliation had transformed into public accountability. Laura, previously isolated and silenced, now held both the evidence and the moral high ground. Her eyes met Mr. Carter's with gratitude, yet a steely determination lingered. This wasn't just about one slap one night or one humiliation. It was about all the years of hidden suffering finally exposed, finally validated, and now finally actionable. The restaurant, a place of celebration, had become a stage where private cruelty collided with public justice. And in that collision, Laura discovered an unshakable truth. When the weight of abuse is lifted into the light, the perpetrators cannot hide, the enablers cannot feign ignorance, and courage becomes contagious. Laura felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear, relief, and righteous anger coursing through her veins. The room was charged with tension, the murmurs of diners and the flashing screens of phones forming a quiet electric hum. She held her phone steadily now, fingers gripping the edges, revealing each photo one by one. There were the faint bruises on her arms from last year, the handprints etched across her wrist from a night Ethan had lost his temper in their kitchen. There were images of red marks on her neck, faint but undeniable proof of how Ethan had cornered her and pushed her in their bedroom. Each photo was a fragment of the story she had been too scared to tell, evidence that silently screamed the truth. Her voice, firm but trembling with emotion, broke the suffocating silence. "This is not the first time. This is years of silence, of fear, of pretending it never happened. And it ends tonight." Ethan's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face as the reality of the exposure sank in. He reached for her, but a diner standing nearby subtly moved to block him. Mr. Carter stepped closer, his presence an unspoken shield. "Step back, Ethan. Any interference with evidence will be noted by law enforcement. This is your last warning." The words hung in the air like a gavel. Laura's chest rose and fell rapidly. For years, she had been trapped in a cycle of intimidation and gaslighting. Ethan's casual smirks, his repeated, "You're too sensitive," comments, his financial control. Everything had convinced her that she was powerless. But tonight, for the first time, power shifted. She glanced at Sophie, who nodded subtly, eyes wide but determined. Sophie's presence reminded Laura that she was not alone, that the public could see the truth, and that courage could ripple outward, inspiring even the timid. Laura's hand swiped through the photos, enlarging the ones that told the clearest story of abuse. She displayed a close-up of a handprint pressed across her upper arm, deep purple bruises stark against her pale skin. "You see this," she said, raising her voice so the entire restaurant could hear. "This is not an accident, not a moment of anger, not a fleeting misunderstanding. This is a pattern, a deliberate act of control, intimidation, and violence." Ethan's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, probably to deny, to gaslight, but the murmurs of the crowd, the faces pointing phones toward him, and Mr. Carter's unwavering gaze froze him in place. Laura felt a wave of clarity. All those years of silent suffering had led to this moment. She was no longer just defending herself. She was exposing a cycle, holding the abuser accountable in front of witnesses, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss her pain. She showed a photo of her hand, swollen and bruised after an argument Ethan had provoked months earlier. "And this," she said, voice cracking but gaining strength with every word, "is why silence is dangerous. Because it allows abuse to continue, it allows lies to form, it allows people like him to think they are untouchable." Some diners nodded, whispering to one another. A woman in the back murmured, "It's about time someone called him out." Others discreetly filmed, adding layers of proof that the night would not fade into obscurity. Sophie, emboldened by Laura's courage, stepped closer and said clearly, "I have seen it too. He tries to humiliate women when no one is looking, uses threats and intimidation. I was scared, but I can't stay silent anymore." Gasps echoed, and a few heads turned toward the restaurant entrance as murmurs grew louder. Margaret, her composure cracking, leaned toward Ethan, whispering frantically, but Laura did not flinch. "No more whispers. No more pretending. This is reality," she said, lifting her phone higher so the images were impossible to ignore. The photographs, the witness testimony, and the public attention created an undeniable record. Laura's heart raced, but she felt a profound sense of liberation. For the first time, her voice carried weight, and it would be heard. Ethan tried to reach for her phone again, his movements desperate now, but diners subtly stepped in, creating a barrier, murmuring, "Don't touch her." You're in public now. Mr. Carter's calm but firm voice intervened again. If you touch her or the phone, you'll be arrested immediately. You are creating evidence of obstruction and continued assault. Ethan froze, and Laura realized that the private terror she had endured for years was no longer confined to the walls of their home. Every photo, every witness, every reaction from the diners solidified the chain of accountability. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Her silence had ended, but the consequences for Ethan were only just beginning. Laura's eyes scanned the room, seeing the mix of shock sympathy and quiet admiration. The humiliation he had tried to impose on her had boomeranged, amplified by truth and courage. The fear that had kept her trapped for years now morphed into strength, a new kind of resolve. She raised her voice one final time before the next chapter unfolded. This ends tonight. No more silence, no more excuses, no more control. I am done living in fear, and I will ensure that the law sees this for what it is: deliberate, repeated, and criminal. The words lingered powerful and unwavering. The restaurant held its collective breath, witnessing the transformation of a victim into a force of justice, her personal suffering now exposed, undeniable, and irrevocable. Laura's heart was still pounding, adrenaline mixing with a sense of vindication as the reality of the situation began to settle. Phones continued to flash, capturing every moment, and the low hum of whispers turned into a wave of chatter as diners discussed what they had just witnessed. Someone had already called 911, and the sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, adding a surreal, almost cinematic tension to the restaurant. Ethan's face was a mask of disbelief, panic, and anger, the red of humiliation searing across his cheeks as he realized that the public exposure he had never feared before was now undeniable. Officers arrived swiftly, professional, and composed, their presence commanding immediate attention. They approached the table, badges gleaming, radios crackling, and one of them gently but firmly addressed Ethan. "Sir, you are being detained for domestic battery in public. Please step away from the victim and comply with our instructions." Ethan sputtered protests, voice raised, but the murmurs from the crowd and the unwavering presence of Mr. Carter, who now stood beside Laura, made any defiance futile. Laura handed the phone to a police officer, pointing to the images of her injuries over the past months and years. "These are not isolated incidents," she explained calmly, though her chest heaved. "This is a pattern. He has been violent toward me multiple times. You can see the evidence here." The officer nodded, documenting everything meticulously, and another officer guided Ethan toward a patrol vehicle, his hands cuffed in front. Laura watched a mix of relief and lingering anger washing over her as the man who had controlled and terrified her for so long was finally being held accountable. Outside, reporters who had been alerted by diners' live streams began filming, capturing Ethan being placed in the car and the gravity of the situation unfolding in real time. Laura felt a twinge of discomfort at the cameras, but it was overshadowed by the satisfaction of justice beginning its course. Within hours, the video she had shared publicly went viral, shared across social media platforms, sparking outrage and sympathy from viewers nationwide. Comments poured in condemning Ethan's behavior, praising Laura's courage, and critiquing the family's earlier complicity. Mr. Carter remained at her side, coordinating with police and explaining her legal options. "We have enough evidence here for a solid domestic violence case," he said quietly. "The photos, your testimony, the witness statements, and the video footage make it undeniable. The district attorney will take this seriously." Laura felt a surge of empowerment, knowing that the years of fear and suppression were finally transforming into tangible consequences for Ethan. Meanwhile, Margaret and Vanessa stood outside the restaurant, faces pale and flushed with anger, whispering furiously, but their objections fell on deaf ears as the law took center stage. Ethan's professional life began to unravel almost immediately. His employer, notified of the incident, suspended him pending an internal investigation, citing zero tolerance for workplace misconduct and behavior that could damage the company's reputation. Clients began to withdraw contracts, citing the negative publicity, and colleagues avoided him, the aura of untouchability evaporating in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Laura, in contrast, began receiving messages of support, job opportunities, and advice on resources for survivors of domestic violence. Legal proceedings were set into motion with Ethan arraigned on charges including domestic battery harassment and public endangerment. The chain of evidence she had meticulously collected photos, hospital records, and the live videos formed an unbreakable narrative of repeated abuse. She met with the district attorney and provided statements detailing each incident, reinforcing her credibility and painting a full picture of a pattern of abuse rather than an isolated event. The case also opened an investigation into Margaret and Vanessa's complicity with social services and law enforcement, scrutinizing whether their inaction constituted neglect or enabling of domestic violence. Laura felt a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. The people she had once considered family were now legally implicated in their moral failures. As the days passed, Ethan's bail conditions were set: mandatory anger management restraining orders and a prohibition from contacting Laura. He faced mounting legal bills, public shaming, and the collapse of his social standing. The media coverage ensured that any attempt to spin the narrative in his favor was futile. Laura, meanwhile, began to reclaim her life. She found a new apartment, engaged a personal therapist to navigate the trauma, and started building a support network of friends and professionals who respected and empowered her. The legal system, in conjunction with public accountability, had finally validated her suffering, turning years of fear into a structured path toward justice. Her experience served as both a warning and a beacon for others in similar situations. Silence was dangerous, but courage, documented, strategic, and public, could bring about real consequences. By the end of the week, court documents were filed, evidence secured, and Ethan faced a series of hearings that would determine not only his legal fate, but also the tangible restoration of Laura's autonomy and dignity. The transformation from victim to survivor, from silenced spouse to public advocate, was complete in that moment, with every photo, witness, and legal action serving as bricks in the foundation of her new life. The public humiliation that had initially terrified her had become a tool of justice, reshaping her reality and ensuring that Ethan Bennett could never again wield fear as a weapon against her or anyone else. Laura stepped out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the city lights flickering against the tears still lingering on her cheeks. Every breath felt heavier yet freer, at the same time as if the weight of years of fear, control, and humiliation was slowly lifting. She clutched her small bag tightly. Inside were copies of the photos, medical records, and witness statements that had already set the wheels of justice in motion. The hum of passing cars, the distant sirens, the murmurs of late-night pedestrians all seemed distant compared to the storm she had just endured and survived. Each step she took was a declaration: no longer a silent victim, no longer trapped under Ethan's shadow, no longer bound by a family that had turned a blind eye. The thought of the upcoming legal proceedings sent shivers down her spine, but also a strange thrill. Justice was not only possible, it was inevitable. At her apartment, Laura unpacked meticulously, placing each piece of evidence into a secure folder, a tangible armor for the battles ahead. She called Mr. Carter, who reassured her about the next steps: hearings for domestic violence, restraining orders, and the initiation of her divorce. She realized that the path ahead was long and daunting, but the sense of control she now felt was intoxicating. The first night alone, Laura sat by the window, the city lights reflecting on her tear-streaked face, and whispered softly to herself, "This is the beginning of me, not the end of everything I feared." She allowed herself to finally mourn, not just the bruises and the fear, but the years of lost autonomy, of whispered threats, of gaslighting, and the constant tension that had gnawed at her soul. And in that morning, there was also the faint glow of hope. The next day brought the first glimpse of the world outside the trauma. Laura met with a therapist specializing in domestic abuse, someone who understood the legal, emotional, and psychological nuances of long-term abuse. Sessions were intense, filled with sobs, anger, and disbelief at how long she had endured. But slowly, her voice grew stronger, her narrative clearer. She was not ashamed anymore. Her story was not her fault. It was a testament to her resilience. Calls from friends, distant relatives, and even strangers flooded in, offering support, advice, and admiration. Laura realized the network she had feared she lacked was actually waiting once she spoke up, once she refused to stay silent. The legal battles began in earnest. Court dates were set and Ethan appeared restrained, his arrogance replaced with caution. The photos, the witness testimonies, the video footage from the anniversary night, all meticulously presented, painted a damning picture. Laura, dressed sharply and walking with a purposeful stride, faced Ethan in the courtroom for the first time in months. His eyes darted nervously. He no longer had the power of intimidation. Each objection, each motion filed, each piece of evidence submitted was a step toward reclaiming her life. Outside the courtroom, the media buzzed quietly, respecting the ongoing proceedings, but highlighting the story as a cautionary tale and a tale of empowerment. Laura allowed herself small smiles when she caught glimpses of support from the community, the acknowledgement of her courage echoing in her chest. At home, she began rebuilding not just physically, but emotionally. She started journaling, painting, and reconnecting with passions that had been suppressed by years of fear and control. Each day, she reclaimed a piece of herself, realizing that survival was only the first act, thriving was next. The ending of this chapter did not mean forgetting or forgiving Ethan. It meant establishing boundaries and security, reclaiming autonomy, and asserting the reality of her experience. On her final walk to the courthouse for the hearing that would grant her restraining order and finalize divorce proceedings, she felt the gravity of history and the weight of freedom intertwining. Her strides were confident, purposeful, every step echoing defiance against the years of manipulation and violence. And yet, as she reached the courthouse steps, a flicker of apprehension crossed her mind. Margaret's voice, Vanessa's smirk, the subtle threats, they still lingered. A part of her knew this was far from over. But this time, Laura was armed not just with evidence and legal representation, but with courage, clarity, and an unshakable resolve. As she adjusted her sunglasses, shielding the fresh bruises from public view, she whispered to herself, "He gave me blood on our anniversary, but he also gave me freedom, and I will never give it back." Behind her, the city moved on, unaware of the private battles fought and won, but Laura knew the future was hers to shape. Somewhere in the background, a shadow, Margaret, eyes blazing, watched, simmering with fury, vowing to restore her son's honor. It was a promise that hinted at future challenges, a narrative still unfolding, yet Laura welcomed it with a steely grin. Because now she was no longer afraid. The curtain had lifted the stage set, and she was ready for the next act, one of resilience, justice, and the reclamation of her life.